Welcome to the webinar on State and Local Measures of School Accountability, hosted by the CSU West Education and Workforce Development Committee. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. I'm Alma Lopez, Policy Analyst with CSU West. Before we get started, I'm going to share a few housekeeping announcements. Please note that this webinar is being recorded. Right now, you can access the slides from today's presentations in the handout pane of your GoToWebinar control panel. A recording of the webinar will be available in the coming days on the CSU West website and on the CSG Knowledge Center page. All participant lines are in listen-only mode until we take questions at the end of all the presentations. If you have a question during the presentation, please let us know by typing your question in the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel located in the bottom right portion of your screen. Written questions will be read out loud during Q&A, so I encourage you to submit them throughout the webinar. The chair of the CSU West Education and Workforce Development Committee, Idaho Representative Wendy Horman, will be facilitating this webinar along with the vice chair of the committee, New Mexico Senator William Souls. At this point, I will turn the floor over to Representative Horman, who will share some background information on this webinar, followed by Senator Souls, who will introduce today's speakers. Representative Horman?
Thank you, Alma, and thank you to everyone who's taken a few minutes to join us here today. I know how valuable an hour is in December when we're all getting ready for the legislative session. So we hope that this conversation that we have today, which is an effort to continue the dialogue we had at the annual meeting of Vail, will be useful to you. We certainly will invite feedback on that. We are trying these webinars. I think this is the first one, if I understood Alma correctly, that CSG West has done. So we'll try this today and see if it's a good platform for dialogue and exchange of information and learning. So school accountability was one of the topics that many of our committee members were interested in discussing following our Vail meeting. So today's presenters will review some alternative measures for school accountability, community schools, and teacher and student assessments. So as we're watching the national news here with the ESEA reauthorization, we're seeing that federal standardized tests are falling out of favor. So I think our states are looking for what do we use instead, looking to explore alternative measures on which to base our accountability system. So our experts today will discuss steps that we can take from a policy standpoint to encourage and support local accountability. So with that, Senator Souls, if you would present today's panelists.
Good afternoon. Yes, it's my pleasure to do so, or afternoon for most of you. I guess it's still morning over on the West Coast. This is Senator Bill Souls from New Mexico, and it's my pleasure to first introduce Julian Vasquez Heilig. He's a PhD professor of educational leadership and policy studies and an award-winning researcher and teacher, professor of educational leadership and policy at Cal State Sacramento. So Dr. Heilig, if you would please.
Great, thank you. I'm so glad to join everyone here today to talk about where the direction that we could head. As was alluded to by the moderator, ESEA looks like it's now come out of conference committee. And it also looks like that ESEA is going to allow states and localities to have more say in how we measure a variety of things, how we hold ourselves and our schools accountable via a variety of metrics. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. First, let me talk a little bit, No Child Left Behind, and I have 8 minutes and I have 10 slides, so I'll have to move through these quickly. But essentially, No Child Left Behind was born in Texas. It was born in a Senate bill in the early 1990s when Coach Page, or Secretary Page, and George W. Bush went to Washington. They took the Texas approach to accountability with them. It was codified in No Child Left Behind. But now it turns out that Texas never had a miracle, that they said they'd never closed the achievement gaps. They never had high schools that had 0% dropout rates. And so the fact that all students weren't proficient by 2014 has created some disillusionment amongst former supporters of the Texas approach to accountability. If we go to the next slide. So the question is, did it even work? And so recent research showed that actually under No Child Left Behind, our improvement on the NAEP slowed, the slope of improvement slowed. And if you've been watching the news this last month, our NAEP scores for the first time in several decades did not improve. If we can go to the next slide. So the dominant paradigm of high-stakes testing and accountability has been a top-down approach. It's been hierarchical and essentially the opposite of community-based approaches, locally-based approaches to education reform. But there's a lot of research now coming to the forefront that shows how communities can be engaged in these conversations. Over the past 20 years, for example, community approaches, local approaches have emerged as powerful forms of engagement in education reform. Can you go to the next slide? So Mark Warren, for example, has written extensively about community-based approaches to reform. He argues that the public engagement in education reform is a way to address the historical inequities. It's a way to see our communities as the solution rather than the problems in these issues. And so these civic alignments in impoverished communities, they build civic and political capacity in a democracy. So when we actually involve communities in these conversations for education reform, instead of it being top-down and it being bottom-up, communities are empowered. Changes in these existing groups, the underlying inequities, of course, must be addressed. We must address capacity issues, but relationships are key in building education reforms from the bottom up and building that social and cultural capital. If we go to the next slide. So specifically, how can we do accountability? Of course, we talked about accountability was born in Texas. It came to DC from Texas, and it's top-down and hierarchical. So how do we do accountability in a way that is local, that is community-based? How can we do it in a bottom-up fashion? If you go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about California's approach to local accountability. Of course, legislators have to think about the budget. They have to think about appropriation. And so the California context in terms of school finances is very similar to many other states. There just isn't enough money to go around. And so here's some of the specifics, to the caps and the issues. California went from a state that was a top 5 spending state to being a bottom 10 spending state because of the different things that happened in school finance over the years. If we go to the next slide. And so the idea was, how can, and what a lot of folks don't know is that accountability and school finance have always been intertwined. Texas accountability was born in, I think it was SB 7, which was a school finance bill. It was a Robin Hood finance bill. And so these ideas have been intertwined for decades. So what California did was they said, we're going to intertwine school finance and accountability. And what we're going to do is we're going to create local approaches to accountability by requiring districts to set long-term and short-term goals in what are called LCAPs. Now, these LCAPs involve a community-based process. There's committees, parent advisory committees, there's English language learner committees, there's requirements in the legislation for public comment, for hearings, and for adoptions, and the approval process is laid out in the legislation. The legislation also requires goals, the districts have specific goals that be qualitatively and quantitatively measured. And this is a key piece that you're seeing in ESEA now, is that the word much is used in ESEA in terms of qualitative approaches, climate approaches, additional data in addition to high-stakes testing, because we've thought that high-stakes tests represent the things we care about, climate, teacher quality, etc. But we also have the data to measure those different variables, and I'll talk about some of those variables in just a moment. And then, of course, the state has priorities. So communities have flexibility, but the state also laid out a set of priorities that they wanted to see in the local accountability. Next slide, please. So there's the priorities that must be addressed, and there's a list here, and you see school climate, which you also see in ESEA's authorization currently. There's also a focus on foster youth, English language learners, parental involvement, multiple measures of student achievement, which you also see in ESEA, And so, ESCA is really going to empower these types of approaches, which is bottom-up, locally based approaches that are strategic in long-term and short-term ways, using multiple measures. And I know that Dr. Neal is going to talk later about some of the approaches on the East Coast in terms of student assessment. But we have now some flexibility. I remember when I was in Texas, there were Republican legislators that were asking me, well, what kind of flexibility do we have in No Child Left Behind? Well, we didn't really have much. We had AYP, we had certain testing requirements, we had certain demographic requirements, et cetera. There was very little flexibility, but it looks like with this reauthorization that that we'll have some flexibility to use these types of approaches. Next slide, please. So just generally, there's an emerging set of conversations about the local accountability in California. The legislation envisioned it as an 8-year implementation. There's been a general amount of enthusiasm. There has, of course, been critiques in our review of, for example, in our review and a recent paper we just submitted for publication, peer-reviewed publication, we noted that the civil rights organizations were involved with very few of these LCAPs and in the top 50 largest districts, which we think is problematic and something that we really need to work towards. But there are other critiques, for example, from PACE, that it went into effect too quickly, that there need to be opportunities for tweaking the LCAPs, that the template might be too, I read a piece today saying that the LCAPs look too much like IEPs and are too restrictive, and that, our district's really interested in engaging communities. There are some districts that have engaged communities in these conversations more than others. Next slide. So that's just a quick overview. You can also read more about local accountability on my blog, Cloaking Inequity, in the Community-Based Accountability category tab. You can read a peer-reviewed journal article that was published in the Urban Education at bit.ly, California Local Accountability. And for bit.ly addresses, the case of the letters is very important. And that concludes my conversation. I look forward to listening to the other panelists.
Hi, this is Monty Neal from FairTest. I'm the Executive Director of FairTest. I don't know, I think we're going to do just introduce ourselves. So I'm very pleased to be here and thank folks for the invitation. Next slide, please. That is our website up there. You can see a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about there, and you can also send a message to me using the contact form there if you want to get in touch afterwards. So following up on Julian's excellent presentation, we at FairTest have noted many problems with testing. We're hardly alone in doing this. They became really prominent with No Child Left Behind and the waivers that the Obama-Duncan administration provided. And a lot of this, not the testing, but a lot of the accountability, looks like it will go away or at least be deferred to the states with the new federal law. This includes too much testing, too much multiple choice and short answer, the high stakes, and the consequences of narrowed curriculum and teaching to the test and so on. Next slide, please. So this was really educationally unsound as a consequence, and it spawned in turn a major national resistance. There were, we estimate, perhaps 550,000 refusals to take state tests scattered across the country, though concentrated in a few states, particularly New York, New Jersey, Colorado, Illinois, Oregon, and Washington, New Mexico. I'd say those are probably the primary states. Through the movement and other things, there's been some victories already won. A number of states, such as California, have ended their graduation tests, or in California's case, it's on a 3-year moratorium. And states have begun to carve out, begun to reduce the amount of testing, and districts in particular have, although that is coming slowly. Now, the new ESEA that now looks pretty well certain to pass is going to allow states to overhaul assessment, which I'll talk about in a minute. New Hampshire already has started to do so under a waiver. But I'd like to add that around accountability, that defers all the sanctions and the control over accountability to the states. However, it does say that in you have to rank order all the schools, which we view as a continuing problem. And it also then says that the test results have to count for 51% of any weighting formula given. And so the additional indicators that Julian talked about, some are given as suggestions in the law, but pretty much any others the state could use, but they'll have to be less than half. And so the problem remains about what kind of assessments are going to be, and currently they remain almost everywhere primarily standardized tests. Next slide, please. So we at Fair Test, we've been looking at this and promoting alternatives for the better part of 30 years now. And here are just some key hallmarks of what alternatives could look like. Projects, performances, portfolios. We strongly believe that the great majority of the assessments need to be teacher designed and controlled, not centrally controlled, not top down. That's really an analog to community based, but in this case really the specifics, it's course related. It really needs to be teacher led. But they have to be student focused, there has to be a sense of student empowerment over this. The example I'm going to show you in a minute will I think illustrate that. The formative assessments are key here, that is providing feedback to students to help them in the learning process. The danger is that we're now seeing tons of crummy little standardized tests being touted as formative assessments, and a whole push to sort of fill in a space by corporate providers who want to sell products under the name of formative assessments or performance assessments or outcome-based and so on. And I think this will be a real problem. It is important to produce viable data for public reporting. We concur that knowing whether kids have learned is a critical function here. Next slide. And there are ways to do that. The best U.S. example that has survived No Child Left Behind, there were many good ones that were really killed by No Child Left Behind, is the New York Performance Standards Consortium. It's now 38 schools in New York State, most in New York City. They're all public high schools with a standard New York City admissions process, and they demographically mirror the New York City student body. So a few years back, the consortium did an outcome study, and they're from its research on 26 of then 26 New York City schools. If I could see the next slide, please. These are their slides. To graduate, all students have to complete 4 performance assessment tasks. Schools have additional tasks they may require, or portfolios, and certainly course completion and so on. This, by the way, has been approved by the state of New York. Next slide, please. The teachers designed their rubrics, so all students are judged on the basis of the rubrics. They have to defend their work before a committee that includes the sort of key teacher from the school, one person from outside the school who's expert in the topic area, and then one other person who may be from inside the school, that is another teacher, or from outside. The Common Core Standards of New York, the tasks do meet those. They reflected the old standards too. Indeed, the opinion of the folks, and which I concur, in the consortium is that their assessments do a better job of evaluating student progress on any reasonable standards than standardized tests do. Next slide, please. So what are the outcomes of these? One more thing before I go. The students largely select their own tasks. They often emerge out of classroom work, but the students pick which tasks they are going to do in specific. That is, what history topic they're going to write their research paper on, which may well turn into a 20-page research paper, what science project, and so on, with faculty guidance. It's the commonality is expressed through the common scoring guides. So the graduation rates for Blacks, Hispanics, English language learners, students with special needs, students in poverty are all much higher. What you see at the top of this slide is the percentage of students in the consortium as compared with New York City high schools. Below that are the graduation rates and the dropout rates. You can see, for example, that I would not argue that the ELL or special needs graduation rates are great. In fact, I don't think anybody's particularly great. Asians come close, but they are significantly better. They're nearly double the city average for English language learners and students with disabilities. In fact, so they're really superior outcomes that they are finding. Next slide, please. Then the students, they send more kids to college than do the average New York City schools, and they're well above the national average, by the way. Meanwhile, of those that are going to college, you see that these are some of the percentages of African Americans and Latino students compared to national averages for college acceptance. Next slide, please. But in addition to simply getting into college, what's really critical is whether they stay in college. And they've had additional data since then. I don't have any slides, but these kind of numbers are holding up, that the persistence in college, into this case, into the second year, their persistence seriously exceeds the national and New York State averages. What that tells them is that in the real world, this process of performance assessments tied to, in many of the schools' case, a really project-oriented curriculum, actually prepares students much better for college. They know how to write research papers. They know how to talk with faculty because they do a lot of seminars. They know how to ask questions. They know how to do research. They know how to, have discussions with other students. They can do all the things that colleges actually expect you to be able to do, and they already know how to do it. So this prepares them much better for the future. Next slide, please. As you can see, they've been looking also, many of their students go to New York City State or city schools, the City University of New York, both 2- and 4-year colleges, and their percentages who have graduated or who remain after 2 years or more is also significantly higher. Next slide, please. So before the resource, just a couple other things. The consortium is by no means the only high-quality assessment out there. There's a thing we highly recommend called the Learning Record. You can find information about it at learningrecord.org. It's definitely a complicated process. It's similar to a portfolio, but it's much better structured than typical portfolios are. So the consortium folks are now have adapted the Learning Record and are beginning to pilot its use in early grades in 10 pilot schools in New York City. Again, there's long-time evidence before the Learning Record was essentially killed by No Child Left Behind, indicating superior outcomes, and teachers who got to use it and got knowledgeable about it found it fantastic resource and professional development. Because we think one of the things that happens with assessment is its strong professional development. So I will end by noting that, repeating, under the new ESEA, which will be called ESSA, which almost certainly is going to pass now, states are going to be able to design new systems. New Hampshire has already done so. As a result, they administer in the pilot districts under the new system, they administer the state test only once each in elementary, middle, and high school, not every grade 3 through 8. Instead, they use a mix of state and local performance tasks and similar assessments. Again, they already have a waiver. 7 states can be in the initial group of pilot states. Others can join later. So we recommend that states take a very careful look and think seriously about doing it, because high-quality education demands that we tie assessment into the rest of high-quality teaching and learning, and that the assessments can't be less than what we want our kids. And the standardized tests, including Smarter, Balanced, and PARP, are far less than our kids deserve. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Cheryl Dultz, and I'm with the San Juan Unified School District, which is a school district in suburban Sacramento. And I'm excited to be here today to talk with you about an accountability measure that is peer-based and peer review-based. Next slide, please. In my current role, I'm a lead consulting teacher for our Center for Teacher Support, and I'm also a mentor for peer facilitators and administrators. I taught children for 24 years, and I taught at a school that partnered with California State University, Sacramento to work jointly in pre-service work. I also worked as an assessment mentor and an instructional technology specialist. Next slide, please. It's important as we begin this conversation that you understand the overview of my presentations because it all builds together. So I'll take you briefly through our principles and beliefs, the components of the system, and what exactly is peer assistance and review, or PAR, who participates in this process, what the process is, and what we've learned along the way. Next slide, please. We believe in the San Juan Unified School District that the purpose of a peer review system must be to ensure high quality teaching and learning for students. A peer review process is built on collaboration and partnership in a unique way between the school district and the San Juan Teachers Association and the union. And we believe that you also can't just pull out PAR, but that you have to look at a complete and total system for beginning and also veteran teachers by other teacher leaders. Next slide, please. So in our current system of professional growth, and we call it a system, there are three major components. The first being induction, and this is a way by which our district collaborates with the Commission on Teacher Credentialing to ensure that teachers clear their credential through a rigorous induction process. In California, that originally was what we called BITSA, Beginning Teacher Support and Assessment Legislation, which was brought to bear in 1998. And we also believe there should be support for professional practice. And finally, our Ed Code in California, Ed Code 44500, allows for PAR for tenured teachers. It's important to note that in our district, we've had PAR in place for 15 years, and any teacher that has gone through our induction program has not been referred to PAR, and we feel that's a very powerful statistic. Next slide, please. So let's look at this idea of PAR, and really within our system there are two types of support. There's a voluntary peer assistance, and there's peer assistance and review, which is involuntary. In peer assistance, the support is determined by the teacher, and in peer assistance review, it's targeted support. So let's take a deeper dive at both of these types of support. Next slide, please. So peer assistance is when a teacher self-identifies that they need support and they contact the San Juan Teachers Association. In many cases, this is a teacher who has returned to the classroom from a leave, or it might be a teacher who's been assigned a different grade level. Let's say from kindergarten, they've moved from kindergarten to 8th grade, and they just seek support. At that time, after they contact the San Juan Teachers Association, a consulting teacher is assigned to support this teacher, and I'll go more in depth about a consulting teacher in a moment. This is a completely confidential process. There's no evidence collected for their portfolio. The consulting teacher reports to a governance panel if resources are needed, or if there's some type of resistance encountered, which is not usually the case. And the principal in this role is also the evaluator. They remain in the evaluator. Next one, please. Peer assistance and review is entirely different. And when you've been referred for peer assistance and review, an improvement plan is developed with a consulting teacher, the administrator who made the evaluation, and the teacher. Under peer assistance and review, there needs to be a minimum of 3 hours of weekly support, which includes observations, coaching, and other resources as needed. A panel, a governance panel, receives updates on the performance of the teacher. And at the end of the first year, the governance panel makes a recommendation to the Human Resources Department concerning employment. So in peer assistance and review, there are several outcomes, but one of them can be dismissal. Let's go to the next, please. So what is peer assistance and review exactly? I'd like to call your attention to a very important paper in terms of really talking about what peer assistance and review is. It's called Getting Serious About Teacher Support and Evaluation by Julia Coppage and Daniel Humphrey in 2011, and that will also be in part of your handouts. So what exactly is PAR? Essentially, it's like intensive support for struggling teachers. That support may include modeling of lessons, co-teaching, co-planning of lessons, coaching with targeted feedback in regards to the areas that the teacher has been determined to need improvement, peer observations of exemplary teachers, analysis of student work. All of those things may be in the support plan for this peer assistance and review process. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at the participants in this system. So in the PAR process, you have 4 major players. The first is the referred teacher, and the referred teacher is referred because they have not met standard in 2 of the 6 standards for the California Standards to their teaching profession. Another player is the consulting teacher. The consulting teacher is the teacher or peer that provides support and also submits reports to a governance panel. An administrator is also an important part of this process, and they work collaboratively with the consulting teacher and the referred teacher. And the governance panel oversees all this process, and they're led by 2 co-directors. So let's break each of those apart. If you could, next slide, please. Thank you. So a referred teacher enters PAR after receiving unsatisfactory marks in 2 or more standards. And remember, there are 6 standards for the teaching profession, so if they receive unsatisfactory in 2 or more, they could enter PAR. They have a responsibility that once they're in PAR, that they work with the consulting teacher, they work with the governance panel, and they work with their administrator to identify and implement high-quality instruction in areas identified for growth. The next slide, please. A consulting teacher is the person that provides support. They're the peer that works alongside this teacher throughout this process. Consulting teachers have a 4-year term. At the end of their 4-year term, they go back to a classroom. There's a very rigorous selection process. In fact, it's the most rigorous of any process in the district. There's a written application, there's a panel interview, and there's an observation of teaching. Consulting teachers are also skilled, and they calibrate weekly. They have weekly meetings where they observe video of teachers, and they work together to make sure that they're calibrated, and they are released full-time from the classroom for 4 years so that they can provide in-classroom support to teachers who are struggling. Next slide, please. The administrator also has a role in this process. They coach and observe teachers to identify for areas for growth. They collaborate with the referred teacher and the consulting teacher to develop that improvement plan. That's done with all 3 people working collaboratively. They also, when the CT delivers their report to the panel every 6 weeks on progress, they also participate in that meeting, and they also participate in the discussion of next steps. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. The co-directors chair this governance panel, and that is the president of the Teachers Association, and currently in our district is the assistant superintendent of secondary chairs that committee on the district side. They meet jointly to set agendas and discuss issues. They meet with the lead consulting teacher, and they serve as communication conduits to their organizations. So the superintendent of secondary sits on the cabinet with the superintendent, and so he's able to report what's happening within PAR, and the SJTA president is also able to report to teachers at the rep council meetings. The reason we have the assistant superintendent of secondary is he had served on the PAR panel prior. Next slide, please. So let's go through the process. Next slide, yes. So a teacher is referred to PAR after receiving an unsatisfactory marks in 2 or more standards. Then the referred teacher, the evaluating administrator, and the consulting teacher meet to design an improvement plan. Next. At that point, the consulting teacher is to support the teacher in a variety of ways. And that can mean modeling lessons, looking for professional development opportunities, providing observations of exemplary teachers. But there's an expectation that you have to have at least 3 contact hours a week. It's usually more than that. Next slide, please. Every 6 weeks, the consulting teacher presents evidence of performance. And by evidence of performance, this is actually evidence of student work, observations of the classroom that is artifacts of practice, and they present a formal report to the PAR panel. The referred teacher is also there, a union advocate is there, and the site administrator is there. After the consulting teacher presents his or her report, the referred teacher can provide evidence. The union advocate and the site administrator are also given an opportunity to provide evidence of support. Next slide. The panel discusses the evidence presented and makes inquiries to the CT to see if any additional supports are needed. And then at the end of that process, the PAR panel could make a couple of recommendations. Once they are in PAR, they can recommend dismissal, but usually it's one of these 3 things. That a teacher can return to the classroom in a normal evaluation cycle, they continue with PAR for for another year, or they can exit teaching. So what we have learned in our next, go ahead, you can go to 2 slides. That this induction PAR collaboration is carried over to other labor management issues, and that there's a lot of collaboration, transparency, and trust. It also builds capacity of teachers, and it goes through with one of our shared beliefs that improvement of teacher quality is a shared responsibility. Next slide. So what happens, what normally happens? We had some referred teachers who were competent and that needed support, and they're now excelling. They've actually exited PAR and are now leaders in the community. And we had some that saw the evidence presented and resigned before the year was over, and we have had some that have moved to dismissal, but not as many as the other. What are our ongoing challenges is the next slide. If you have a new superintendent or school board, that can lead to changes in focus and resources. The term limit, which we thought would work so well, sometimes creates some problems in that it requires the need for continual recalibration and training of teachers, and it also makes it difficult to find qualified consulting teachers because of the extensive process that it takes. So we can go ahead and skip to the last 2 slides. So essentially, in our district, PAR is part of a system of support to support teachers as they grow throughout their career. My contact information is there, and I would be happy to answer any questions at the end. Thank you so much for including me in this opportunity with this important discussion.
Hello. I'm not hearing anyone. Hello? Okay, I apologize for that. I wasn't hearing anything. My name is Ken Zarafis. I'm president of Education Austin. I taught for 12 years 8th grade language arts at a very high need school here in Austin, Texas. For the last 5 years, I've been president of Education Austin. We're a merged local union between the NEA and the AFT. And we've worked on a variety of fronts. I want to thank the previous speakers. You know, Julie and I've worked when he was here at UT. Very appreciative of all his work, omnipresent, and just a prolific writer that has really pushed back against the reform movement. Monty, the work around fair test, the way I got involved in this work was the excessiveness of testing in Texas, the brutal nature that took up 44 days of my school year, almost a fourth of my school year through testing and practice testing. And then lastly, I think most importantly, Cheryl, as a teacher voice is one of the most important things that we have. It's one of the most valuable expert perspectives and voices we have in education and in the direction we should go. I think it's rather ironic as people attack unions that when you look at some of the greatest ideas in public education right now, particularly around the innovation of true charters, not corporate charters, but true charters, and PAR, both came out of the union movement, and it's something that we're very proud of. Early on when I was asked to do this, one of the things that I was identified with was charter schools. I think that some work that we had done with an in-district charter preceded me, and I certainly would like to clarify kind of my focus and where we go. We, a few years ago, 5 years ago, had applied for a grant to develop an in-district charter, a grant through the AFT Innovation Fund, and it was a 3-year grant to allow us to do deep organizing, to find a school in this district that wanted to do an in-district charter, to find freedom, to do some innovative things in the Al Shanker mode of charter schools. So we began our work, and we found a school that wanted to do it. But rather than an isolated school that skims and trims, we found a school that, of 130 schools in the district, one said, we want to try this. And Travis Heights became a school that began to engage with parents and teachers, administration. They began to do research around alternative forms of schools and charters here locally and outside of this area. And what we were able to do over a 3-year period was develop a school that does not skim and trim. It is an attendance zone school. Every kid that lives in that neighborhood gets to go to that school, just like any school in this district. It has strong academic, service, project-based organizing, service learning, blended learning, teacher, community, and union voice and decision-making on the campus, a release and ease of some of the testing. It was just a great model. But the downside of it is it took a great deal of time. It took almost 3 years to get to the point where the charter was approved, because the charter is a legal document. You have to make sure that absolutely every I is dotted, every T is crossed, and you can run into problems if even one T is not crossed. And so I began to think, after we gained the success and we were recognized and the school board approved this charter, I began thinking, how can we do it easier? How can we get to the same end in an easier fashion? Take some of the best things that came out of that process and see that schools could make decisions on their academic programming, on how they discipline or how they manage behaviors, how they get teachers and parents and school employees deeply involved in the success of all the kids, and how we can ease up on testing. And over the process of that 5 years, I came across the concept, which is not a new concept, but of community schools, that looked at doing all those things, but adding an additional component of wraparound services. Community schools create deep parent-teacher involvement, create a very specific and strong academic program that the campus, the teachers, the administration, and the community develop, brainstorm, and agree upon. Wraparound services that meets the needs of a lot of our kids that come to our school in a deficit. You know, the old phrase of about 5, 6, 7 years ago is that zip code doesn't determine destiny. And of course that's true. We know that our zip codes do not determine our destinies. But to deny that they have an enormous impact on our reality is naive and foolish. We have to meet kids where they are, and we have to fill gaps. Community schools are an excellent school transformation model that addresses racial inequity and social justice by meeting the kids where they are, filling gaps, and helping them not just to get services they need, because that's one of the misconceptions around community schools, is that they're just a service provider. It's not. Community schools provide services so the kids have an opportunity to succeed in a real way, to graduate, and to move on and break the cycle of poverty. It is something that's so fundamentally important that it's not just social services, but an academic improvement model that helps kids to succeed. In the last few years, what we wanted to do after the success of our in-district charter, I needed money. And so I went back to the AFT and said, we need money. We need money for this grant. And they weren't taking applications that particular year. We talked to Randy Reingarten, my partner from Austin Voices, Alan Weeks. And we spoke to Randy Weingarten about the possibility of doing this work. She was in town for South by Southwest. We were presenting on our in-district charter success. And we talked to her about this idea that we needed some money to take that success and then to blend it into what the community school movement was being successful at achieving nationwide in cities like Cincinnati, Portland, Tulsa, and Albuquerque, and began to take advantage of a feeder pattern in AISD, the Austin Independent School District, that already had 2 schools that I'll refer to in a few minutes that had succeeded in the community school model, but we wanted to develop the elementary and pre-Ks to support that feeder pattern. The AFT, and we also reached out to the NEA, asked both of our parent organizations to fund this project, and we were the only local in the nation that was approved for funding in that particular year for $180,000 per year to develop organizing in this feeder pattern, to develop a community school model that gave wraparound services, strong academics, starting from pre-K, moving up through elementary, into the middle, and high school, with the idea that if you give these types of supports, academic supports, social, health, school supports to students and their families from the day they step in the school door all the way to the time that child graduates, you're going to have higher graduation rates, higher college entrance rates, lower dropout rates, all the things that we want to see as outcomes for schools. We don't just want to talk about opportunities for kids. We want to talk about outcomes for kids. And the community school model helps us to do that. 2 of the schools in this district about 8 years ago were slated for closure. Webb Middle School was scheduled to be closed. A large community-based, as I've often said, the quickest way to get parents involved in a school's business is to tell them that their school is going to close, and they will come out in droves. And people came out to Webb Middle School. They said, you're not going to close our school. And one of the leaders in that community, Alan Weeks, helped to spearhead a movement in that community to saying, no, we're not going to accept this. We have a good school. We have strengths here, but we just need some extra supports. They got together. They identified the support because student mobility was a damaging reality in that school. Kids came and went. They weren't coming to school. Attendance was a difficult thing. So they isolated those two concerns. They created a proposal that was going to attack those two issues, build a strong academic model within a month, and then ask the school board to hold off on any closure until the kids took the test, the state accountability under AYP or NCLB and state accountability. Luckily, the kids were able to perform well enough that they held off for a year. There was a reprieve. In the next year, as they continued to go at these weak points, dealing with mobility, attendance, and student involvement, they began to see improvements. 8 years later, a school that had dropped below 400 students now is over 700 students. What was the lowest performing Title I school, middle school in the district is now the highest performing Title I middle school in the district and one of the highest performing middle schools in the district. A year later, after the Webb Middle School attack and potential closure, its feeder high school, Reagan High School, was threatened with the same closure. Reagan had a proud history, and it had great sports teams, strong academics for years, but had fallen on very difficult times. In the early 2000s, a murder occurred in the hallways, very tragically. And as you can imagine, parents, students, and families left in droves. A school that has a capacity of almost 700 had dropped to well under 600-700 students. It was on the verge of closure. They asked Webb, what did you do? What can we do to stave off this closure? Alan Weeks, again, came in, began to work with schools, asked 3 key questions. What do you love about your school? What are the needs of your school? What do you need? And what are the resources you have to meet those needs? And so you began to see the gaps in the resources that can meet them and then the resources you need to fill voids. Reagan then, through the next year, was able, again, through very intensive efforts, isolating specific needs, a triage approach, they were able to hit enough in the score to be able to stave off a closure. And 7 years later, now, as into the 8th year of success in this community school model, where Reagan has a multitude of wraparound services, they are now an early college and career prep school, which is a neighborhood school. It is not a charter. It is not a magnet. People from the neighborhood go, and people can transfer in if they choose to do so. Their numbers have grown to over 1,300. Students are now graduating with 10, 20, 30, 40, and up to 60 college credits through a dual credit program in this school. It is absolutely amazing what has happened at Reagan High School. What we have stressed through this whole process is that what we do here, whether it's an in-district charter, whether our community schools, Webb and Reagan, these are not products. The charter school industry wants us to believe that you can take a product off the shelf, plug it into a school, and say, you have to fit what we do. And if you don't, you either don't come or you leave. And that is adapting students to the product. We believe it must be grassroots. It has to be a process where whatever idea comes in, they adjust to the needs of the community and the neighborhood, therefore being accountable to the neighborhood, the community, teachers, parents, administrators within that school community, not the other way around. So we stress very much process, not a product. What we see in this, and sadly, you know, really through in Austin, the end of busing occurred very clearly in about 2000. I started teaching in 97. We saw the end of it in 2000, 2001, the last remnants of busing in Austin. But what we've done is we like to talk about the friendly term of neighborhood schools is wonderful, and I believe in neighborhood schools. But what that does is resegregates our communities. And what it has done is it is exposed. It does not allow you to mask racial and social inequities that are inherent in our system. You can mask those through busing, through watering out concerns and problems throughout a district. when people come back to their neighborhoods, the stark reality of economics and race are very clear. Community schools gives us an opportunity to address those things head on, to face and to expose and to address the issues of racial and social inequity that must be addressed. You can't mask it, you can't cover over it, but you have to address it. So we've tried to do that in our community school work. We not only have this grant that I spoke of, but Alan Weeks has secured a Department of Ed community school grant for $2.5 million that's going to do the same work within our Lanier High School feeder pattern. And we're also working on legislative efforts, which this last legislative session, we came within one person of passing strong community school legislation. It had gone through the House, overwhelmingly passed, went to the Senate, we got it out of committee, we had the votes on the floor, but sadly, a very political maneuver by our Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, stopped it from coming onto the floor for a vote, and it was not allowed to go into become law. But that hasn't stopped us. Our efforts has changed the language and the vocabulary of school reform and turnarounds to include community schools. And so I know this is a short time. I hope to be able to answer any questions that you might have around this. I just really appreciate your time.
Thank you, everyone. At this time, from the audience, or if anyone else has any, or if the speakers have any other remarks that they will, I know we're getting close to the time, but to the panelists, is there any suggestions that you can make for legislators in terms of things that they can do to encourage and support local accountability?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, I think one of the things is just to understand the overall conversation that we're having right now in education policy. The last 10 years or so has been really focused on sort of top-down private control approaches. Put in the decisions on these variety of policies in the hands of just a few folks, whether it be charter schools or testing, No Child Left Behind, really privatized assessment. And so what we're talking about here are a variety of approaches that have an empirical and research base, whether it be community-based approaches to assessing teachers in PAR, or be community-based approaches to school turnaround, which is community schools, whether it be community-based approaches to accountability, which you see in the local accountability plans, or community-based assessment, which Fairtest talked about in the New York Consortium. So there are alternatives to top-down private control approaches. These approaches, which are locally based and locally controlled, have research surrounding them, and I think this is the promise that we have in education policy. I think this is the flexibility that we'll have with the reauthorization of ESEA.
I just want to add a bit of a caution. I think we can go a long way in the new ESEA reauthorization. This is Monty Neal. But as I said, there are definitely some limits that are going to have to ultimately be overcome. But the extent we're able to transform schooling at the local and state levels within the space that we do have is really going to depend a lot on organizing and public education work. Without that, legislators will be insufficiently involved.
This is Senator Souls. Are there other?
I hope that wasn't me. But anyway, I was about done. I just think that people really need to look at organizing efforts and how people have organized for educational change and to be more effective at educating, persuading, and if necessary, pressuring legislators.
Ms. Stoltz?
I'd like to point out the importance of the idea of collaboration in terms of working with the association and districts. Our work was part of a collective bargaining agreement and has continued for 15 years. So I think it is important that in all of these issues that we discussed today, the collaboration between the unions and districts and partnerships with universities, it really is about partnerships and communities working together for appropriate accountability measures.
You know, this is Ken. I think the things that I've used is kind of my mantra, and that I find success if a school in union work, you oftentimes go to schools or into systems where they may not be working so well, and when they don't work well, two things don't seem to be happening. One, there's not good communications, and two, because of that, you have bad relationships. And so what we always try to achieve is strong communications to develop quality relationships. And I think that applies, it's very general and very broad, but it applies really everywhere that I work within this union world, is that in working with a principal, working with a teacher, working with administration, I have to keep the lines of communication open, or as a parent, lines of communications open, so that I have a relationship, so that I then, because of those two things, I then have good outcomes for kids within public education. It's a very simple way of approaching it, but I always try to keep that in mind as I work. And I think that we have an opportunity with the reauthorization. It has community schools in it, amongst other things, that we really have an opportunity. I'm cautious. I live in Texas, so I'm cautious about it, but really an opportunity to move forward and change public education for the good.
Thank you, everyone. We are coming to an end, so I'd like to thank, again, the panelists for their time. Thank you, everyone else, for joining us today. If there's any additional questions or clarifications that you may have, feel free to send them my way. My email is alopez@csg.org. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, Julian.
Thanks.
Bye.